What could possibly ignite fierce competition between nations leading to a race like no other? Join us on a voyage back in time as we delve into the intriguing world of spice trade and unravel the captivating tale of the pepper race that reshaped the Dutch colonization of new lands. Pepper has been valued for hundreds of years. In the 1600s, the Portuguese and the Dutch competed for pepper, which led to a pepper race that changed the way the Dutch colonized new lands. Think about a world where something as easy as a spice could change the course of history. During the pepper race, which was a fight between European forces to control the lucrative pepper trade in Southeast Asia, this was the truth. The Dutch won in the end, and their rule over Indonesia had a big effect on the society and environment of the area. From economics to politics to farming, the pepper race was a big part of how the Dutch tried to colonize the New World and how history turned out. Tighten your seatbelts as we get into the roller coaster of pepper history. The Dutch East India Company, also called VOC, was founded in 1602 with the goal of controlling trade with Asia. One of its main goals was to take over the pepper trade, which at the time was run by the Portuguese. The VOC sent out many missions to find new pepper sources, and they were able to get a hold of the spice. The VOC became one of the most powerful and rich groups in the world because they had a stranglehold on the pepper trade. The VOC set up trade posts and ports all over Asia, including what is now Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and South Africa. The Dutch East India Company did a lot of colonizing because it wanted to keep its pepper monopoly and keep control of the spice trade. The Dutch used their armed power to take over new areas and get control of trade. In Indonesia and Sri Lanka, they put local people to work on farms where they grew pepper and other spices. This led to abuse, slavery, and the destruction of local cultures and customs. Europe's politics and economy were also affected by the race for pepper in a big way. The Dutch and the Portuguese were in a fierce battle to control the spice trade, and this rivalry spread to other trade and colonization areas. The pepper race was part of a bigger battle for power and wealth in the world. In the pepper trade, the Dutch finally became the most powerful country, but this did not come for free. The VOC's attempts to colonize led to the local people being exploited and mistreated, and the Dutch became known for being cruel and not caring about human rights. The VOC was also a big part of the slave trade, which was terrible for African people. The race for pepper was a big reason why the Dutch colonized Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia. Because they lived in the Netherlands, the Dutch had a strategic edge because they could trade directly with powers in the area. This let them cut out the Arab and Indian middlemen who had controlled the pepper trade for a long time. In addition to economic reasons, the Dutch colonization was also driven by political and military concerns. The Dutch East India Company was given quasi-government powers to make deals with local rulers and set up military bases to protect their trade interests. During the time that the Dutch ruled Indonesia, there was a lot of pushback from local rulers and groups who didn't want to be ruled by foreigners. These efforts to fight back came in many different ways, such as military protests, diplomatic talks, and guerrilla fighting. In many cases, people fought back against the Dutch because they wanted to keep their independence, cultural practices, and economic systems. The Java War was one of the most important uprisings. It started when the Dutch put a new land tax on local farmers. Prince Diponegoro was in charge of the resistance. He got a group of local leaders and farmers to fight against the Dutch. The Java War was one of the biggest and longest wars in the history of Dutch colonization, and it had lasting effects on Javanese society. Other important rebel groups included the Aceh War, the Bali Wars, and the West Sumatra Rebellion. Both sides used brutal tactics to try to get the upper hand, which led to a lot of violence and death. When faced with pushback, the Dutch were often harsh and unwilling to give in. They used the military to put down protests, and they often used extreme violence against both citizens and soldiers. The Dutch government also used strict control measures, like forced labor and prison camps, to stop people from protesting and keep things running smoothly. Resistance to Dutch colonization of Indonesia had a big effect. It showed that the Dutch were not unbeatable and that local people could question and fight against their rule. Resistance also sparked nationalist groups, which grew in the early 20th century and finally led to the end of Dutch colonial rule in Indonesia. The pepper race was a big part of how the Dutch took over Indonesia. It gave the Dutch a strong economic reason to set up trade relationships and colonial power over the area. This had long-lasting effects on Indonesia's political, social, and cultural life. But the Dutch colonization was not all good. For example, it involved putting down local opposition and using the native people for economic gain. The Dutch colonization of Indonesia is a reminder of the long and often painful past of European colonialism in the area and around the world.